Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast, where we interview growers from all over the world, both beginners and experts, seeking to learn more about what they know about gardening and how they do things in their garden. Hey, what's up everybody? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 152. In this episode, I interview Chris Swank. He has been gardening for 11 years and grows plants exclusively in Rockwool, which is what we get into in today's episode. He talks all about how he grows his plants in Rockwool, everything from preparing for planting, nutrition, pH, irrigation strategy, environment controls, and more. If you want to see short clips of these podcast episodes, search Garden Talk Clips on YouTube. I also have a gardening channel where I show the plants that I grow. Both of those channels will be linked down in the YouTube description section below. One of my goals for this podcast is to bring free information about gardening to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this episode. Check out their Instant Potting Mix, a soilless grow medium made from 100% organic Coco Coir fiber. It's buffered and triple washed to maintain pH stability and reduce salinity. It comes in a 2-pound brick, which expands to fill up to a 3-gallon grow pot. Click the link in the description section below so you can learn more about their Instant Potting Mix, and the discount code MrGrowIt15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com. Stash Blend. Stash Blend is a 2-1-5 plant additive that can be used with synthetic bottled nutrients or in living soil systems. Simply mix half teaspoon of Stash Blend into a gallon of water, then water your plants with it. Ingredients include corn steep liquor, seaweed extract, humic acid, beneficial bacteria, silica, and mycorrhizal fungi. Check it out at stashblend.com, link in the description section below, and use the discount code THESTASH. And we're back, and I'm joined with Chris from Swank Genetics. How you doing today?
I'm good, bro. How you doing?
Doing good, man. Thanks for coming on to the podcast today. You've been on the From the Stash podcast a couple different times.
Yeah.
Great conversations in those episodes. Real fun conversations. And we are friends IRL in real life. And so you live locally here.
Yep.
And I've been to your grow before. And one thing I noticed is that you grow on Rockwool entirely.
Yeah.
And we are overdue for an episode of growing in Rockwool. I haven't had anybody on this podcast growing in Rockwool yet. I've had some people that started out in Rockwool. They did seedlings in there, and then they transferred over to either like a soil or cocoa or hydroponic system, for example. But growing in Rockwool throughout the entire growth cycle, that's a way you can do it successfully. And so I'm excited to have you on here today and talk all about it.
Yeah, bro. I appreciate you having me on, bro. It's an honor, man. You linking with you and the boys has been it's just so organic how this all happened, man. That's the only way I can put it. That's the best way to describe it. It's just organic, you know. So I appreciate you, man, big time.
I completely agree. Before we get into Rockwool deeply, can you give us an introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into gardening.
Yeah, my name's Chris. I'm the owner, founder of Swank Genetics. We're essentially a genetics company. We focus primarily on breeding genetics, and eventually, as soon as we get to a certain point, we'll be offering those genetics in various forms, seeds, tissue culture, whatever. But yeah, primarily a genetics company. I fell into it by just loving the plant from a very, very young age. I got into it around 2001, and I didn't see my first living plant till around 2013. So, that was it. I mean, that was the change. I saw the plants for the first time growing in full flower, and it just changed everything. I had to learn. I had to figure it out. I had to become a part of it. And a buddy of mine who showed me that garden was willing to take me under his wing and teach me how to grow, and did that for a while. And then we came back, left California, and which is where his garden was, and came back to Vegas and started my own thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, before we started recording, you mentioned you were doing it for about 11 years. Have you been in Rockwool the entire time, or have you tried other grow methods?
So initially when I learned, they were in Coco. So at the garden I was learning out in NorCal, they had an outdoor, which was all soil, and then they had an indoor, which was all Coco under high pressure sodium. So initially I learned Coco, high pressure sodiums indoor, and then just straight soil with amendments outdoor. And then honestly, in doing that, I mean, I know there may be people that aren't going to like me saying this. I could not wait to never touch soil again. I just It's backbreaking, bro. Especially when you're at scale and you're really doing it for real on a farm. It's no joke. And hats off to every gardener that does it, because it's you guys are the real workforce for real. So me being the type of person I am initially, was like, all right, well, how can I create more efficiencies? Just naturally in my life, I'm all about finding efficiencies, and soil just was not it for me. And neither was Coco, neither was most of the alternatives, until I stumbled onto specifically Rockwool.
You mentioned being at scale, and I think that's one good thing to clarify is you're not just a small home grower with a couple tents. You are growing at scale, and yeah, that makes a big difference going from just growing a handful of plants, 6 or 12 plants, up to growing, I don't know, what are you growing, 50, 100 plants plus plants at a time, or what?
It depends. Like when we were on the farm, this is back in like the Prop 215 days. So we had 99 outdoor, and then he had, I don't even know, 150 lights indoor. So yeah, thousands at that point. But it's all broke down. Like the person that taught me how to grow is kind of where I got the ideology of, you can have 100 lights or 200 lights and still be small batch. And that's very counterintuitive to what people think. And it's like, well, no, it's just because you don't have to build a 60 light room or a 100 light room. You can have 100 lights and have 10 light rooms that are all staggered out in various points of growth, and that'll allow you to have, variety and multiple harvests of different genetics. So you're not just sitting there doing the same thing over and over. So yeah, like he's the one that kind of put me into that ideology where it's like, Dad, you've got a lot of lights, but really you don't, because it's all in 8 and 10 light rooms.
Got it. So why Rockwool? First of all, what is Rockwool? We have a lot of folks that are beginners. They might not even know what it is. Can you explain what is Rockwool and why growing it? What are the benefits to grow plants in Rockwool?
Yeah, so it's basically it's spun rock. So they heat rock up, and I don't know that this is necessarily the greatest analogy for it, but think of like a cotton candy machine. They basically get the rock, from my understanding, to like almost a molten state, and they spin it, and it becomes this very fibrous. Yeah, it's like a fibrous, almost kind of like fiberglass insulation for your house would be like the way I could compare like the feel to it, if that makes any sense, but a little denser than that. And yeah, it's a natural thing. People don't think it's natural. Obviously, the process of doing it isn't, but it is essentially just rock melted down and then spun into this very fibrous, soft material. And then that's something that I found when I got into it initially. Like, you asked why. The why was, again, trying to figure out how I could get away from soil. And so I tried Coco, and it's like, all right, well, this is basically just a not soil, and it's still heavy, and it's still messy, it's still dirty, it's still a process that I just don't want to do. How could I get clean? Like, to me, that's the whole point of, if you're going to go through the hurdle of setting up an indoor grow, and it's all about cleanliness indoor. I mean, indoor, you have to extra be careful with what you do. So to me, how can I avoid having soil, like doing dry backs with soil, and now we have dry dust, essentially, so dirt that's going to naturally get into the HVAC and get into the DHU system and get into your fans and your filters, because it's just dry dirt. That's what's going to happen. And Coco, similar. And, sure, there's like pellets and other things you can do, but, and I think when you get to that point, it's just preference. But with pellets, I find that when I tried that, it didn't make sense for the root mass. I like the fact that the roots will actually penetrate through the Grodan, the Rockwool. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got to it. Was, you can pot an entire room. We also pot, which is something that I don't feel is necessarily common practice with people that grow in hydro. But when we pot, you can run through an entire room of pots, several hundred, very quickly, and it's not a lot of weight. It's not hurting. It's not like the whole crew isn't like dreading the day of transplant like you do when you do soil or Coco. It's a very, very easy, friendly thing to utilize, in my opinion.
Got it. So yeah, there's a handful of benefits there. On the flip side, what would you say some of the downsides of using Rockwool is?
You have to be on top of your watering. If at any point you lack on your watering, that's it. Your plants are dead. There's really no buffer. And also, in regards to buffer, from a nutrient standpoint, there's no buffer. The benefit of soil, especially when you're a beginning grower, is that the soil has, like the way I like to tell people that grow in soil, which I'm not a soil king by any means. I probably less than 1% about soil. But the little bit I do know is that, essentially you're never feeding the plant. You're really feeding the soil, and the soil is feeding the plant, So because of that, the soil has its own ecosystem and its own pH and its own EC. So it will act as a buffer if you, the beginner grower, mess something up. You don't have that buffer at all, zero, when it comes to hydro. If you do one wrong feed and it's wrong enough, your plants are dead. You could maybe attempt to bring them back, but if you do something bad enough, they're dead. And, the same could be said for soil, but that bad enough would have to be much worse than it would be, if it was hydro. So yeah, I think the downsides are that there's no buffer there for watering. There's no buffer there for nutrients. You have to really be spot on what you do.
And then how does growing in Rockwool compare to other methods of growing, such as soil hydroponic systems, Coco, in terms of yield and quality?
So the quality thing is, I'm a firm believer that you're a good grower if you can grow good in any medium, and it doesn't mean anything other than that. Like, there's no need to go deep into it. When we talk yields, when we talk, the end result, a lot of that's it's all subjective, it's all objective, it's all preference. There's so many variables to that. So to me, if you can just show me a finished product that doesn't hurt my throat, that has a great nose to it, that tastes good, that's enjoyable all around, I don't really care too much about the bag appeal, but bonus if it's there, it's like, that's what I care about. And then after that, we can talk about how you grew it, because that's, to me, is secondary. People get so wrapped up in how. It's like, just smoke it. If it's good and you enjoy it, then it's good and you enjoy it. Like, don't let the fact that they grew inorganic or organic or in salts or in soil or whatever, don't let that play into what you think about it. Just try the end result first and then work backwards from that and figure out what they did. A lot of people assume I grow soil or organic, or living soil or no-till or all these famous catchy phrases that are popping up in the last 5 years. So it's like, when I tell people, nope, none of that. I'm proud to say that I grow in salts. I'm proud to say that I grow hydroponically, and I'm proud to say that I figured out a way to grow quality flower without all the backbreaking work of soil. Like, I just keep going back to that. I'm a lazy dude, bro.
Yeah, I know quite a few people who say that the yield is better. You're going to get a higher yield. You kind of got more control over the nutrients, pH. You got to kind of be spot on, but you can achieve a higher yield. And as far as quality, you talked about flavor and stuff and kind of comparing and stuff. I've got a lot of your stuff right here, and you were nice enough to gift it to me. And every single one of these is very flavorful. Yeah. So like the papaya syrup is my favorite. It's incredible.
Awesome.
There's a big debate upon growing organically versus growing with synthetic nutrients and the flavor profiles and all that stuff. Right now, it's really just debate. You can definitely still get flavor, and I've got proof right here. Still get flavor from growing in synthetic nutrients, particularly in your style with growing in Rockwool. So I figured I'd mention that one.
I appreciate that. Yeah, man. I've done labs, and 100% labs show that, in my experience, A and B between, like, say, a 600 watt Vivita high pressure sodium versus the Fluence LEDs that I use, right? I use a 630 watt Fluence versus a 600 watt HPS way back 7-8 years ago, when I really started trying to compare an A and B and figure out if LEDs were better. At that time, they were better, because the labs would show that, okay, cool, this genetic, now granted, there's other environmental factors that play into this, but assuming you can get your environments roughly close each time, right? Then your lab shouldn't skew too much. But there'll be differences. But when it goes from, say, 1.7% terpene profile on a dry cured plant when I grow it in a Vivita, and then I grow that same plant under a Fluence, and all of a sudden I have 2.4, 2.6, 2.8% terpene profiles, that's not a little difference. That's like a 60, 70, 80% difference in terpene content. So it's like, that's undeniable. And when you do that for so many labs and so many plants, and you do run that through several different genetics, and you A and B it against the high pressure sodium versus the Fluence, it's like, no. Historically speaking, in my experience with the labs I've paid to get done independently, yes, there are higher terpene profiles in LEDs, at least our LEDs. But I'm also not a person that's going to sit here like most people do and be like, well, that, LEDs suck or HPSs suck, or no, bro, it's preference. Just because you get a lower terpene profile, if when I smell the plant, I like it, you did great, bro. So people get so wrapped up in the data And that's cool when you're trying to develop your way of your processes, but it's not cool to wrap up the end consumer and all that data, because then they're driven by something that they don't fully understand, as opposed to just being driven by their senses, which is the best thing you can do. Smell, taste, touch. We eat food with our eyes before we ever taste it. You know what I mean? If something comes to you and it looks disgusting like sewage because it's spinach based, it may be the greatest dish on earth, but it looks like sewage and you're probably not going to want to eat it, or you're going to have a negative connotation to it right from the jump. So there's no difference to me with plants, and people understanding or wanting to get fed the science. It gets in the way of your base instinct, which is just, how does it smell? How does it taste? It's like, let's just go back to that, and let the growers worry about all this nonsense that we're trying to have a conversation about.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean when it comes down to preference, right? Different strokes for different folks.
Yeah.
Now I want to jump backwards to get into the initial planting in Rockwool. Yeah. So how do you properly prepare and condition Rockwool before planting seeds or clones into it?
Yeah, so Rockwool has a natural higher pH. So I believe it sits somewhere around like 7.5, 7.7, something like that. At least the Grodan, which is the company whose Rockwool I utilize. I believe it's somewhere in the mid to high sevens. So you actually will essentially just get a big, like 100 gallons of water, pH is water down to 5.5, and then we'll drop all of the blocks that we're using into that water to soak for like a half hour to an hour. And essentially what that does is it brings that pH level down to more of a neutral pH of around 6.2 to 6.5, somewhere in that range, which is safe for younger plants. And then, that's it. You essentially just have to, just have to condition the plant, or condition the medium to receive a plant. But that's it. It's super easy. And then the cool thing with that is you don't have to saturate afterwards. Like with soil, a lot of times you'll have to, you'll kind of dampen the soil, and then you'll plant your seed, and then you'll cover it, or you'll plant your clone or whatever, and then you'll go back and rewater the soil. You don't even have to do that because you just did that soaking process. So it kind of also removes a step just in the act of having to do that. So pull it out, put it in a tray if it's a clone, or put it into a block if it's a clone going into a block, or whatever stage of life is. With all of the Rockwool, you have to condition it, if you will, and get the pH correct. And then from there, you just put whatever you're going to put it into.
And then as that is a seedling or a clone that's rooting, what techniques do you use to encourage strong root growth in Rockwool?
I mean, for one, I definitely use Clonex. I'm not a person that says you have to. There's been plenty of times where I've gone and need to take cuts and didn't realize I was out or something like that. We take the cuts anyways because the cuts got to be taken, So, but ideally, I use Clonex if I can, because it has a rooting hormone, and it also kind of just helps when you make a cut. If we're talking in cuts, not seeds, it helps when you make that incision and that cut line to just sterilize it, make sure there's no infection that's going to get into it, and then also give it some hormones and something to kickstart that rooting process. Outside of that, nothing. It's just, I go into the 1.5 inch Aokis, which are the clone cubes that we use. The conditioning of it is really that simple. And as far as seeds go, I'll usually I do the cup tech, where I'll just pH some water to like 6.5, some RO to 6.5, and I'll just drop the seeds into a solo cup, let them sit for usually just one day, and they'll crack. Sometimes 2 days, but never more than 2 days. And then as soon as they split and I see the little taproot, I'll just take them, place them out, taproot down, and pop them in one by one individually into the same 1.5 inch Aokis. So rather than doing clones or seeds, it's always the 1.5 inch Aokis.
So the Clonex that you use, are you just dipping the cutting into that, or are you doing a soak of the Rockwool with the Clonex solution?
No, there's some people that do that, but no, I just do strictly water, and then I just have a little shot glass that I'll pour some Clonex gel into and just dip each clone in, and super easy.
And then what are you using for a nutrient lineup, and how do you go about feedings throughout the growth cycle?
Yeah, so the company we use is Current Solutions. So that's another little thing that's slightly different about us, is that most people have never heard of our nutrient line, and that's because it's made by a company called Current Culture, and Current Culture specializes in DWC, which is deep water culture. So deep water culture, without going into that too much, it's a totally different methodology of growing, where your plants are essentially constantly suspended in water, similar to aeroponics, but aeroponics utilizes misting at certain intervals, whereas with DWC, the roots are literally suspended in water 24/7. And the way that they don't root rot is through a process called hyperoxygenation, where they have oxygen pumps that are essentially pumping air into the water, so much so that the roots don't realize that they're suspended in water. So you don't get that root rot. You don't get what would usually happen to anything if it's sat in water for days, weeks, months. But I utilize their nutrient line in hydro, which can be done, but it's definitely not what the line's designed for per se. It's more designed for the DWC. But yeah, it's called Current Solution. It's a two-part. There's an A and a B for veg. There's an A and a B for bloom. They also have boosters if you want. Depending on what we do, I do or don't use those. If we're growing for flower, I'll utilize the boosters to get some more density. If we're growing for rosin, I do not utilize the boosters, and that's a whole nother conversation. We could have it another time. But yeah, so yeah, just a simple two-part, man. And then as far as regiments, start out very, very light. There is a third part to that. Like it's Current Solutions version of essentially a CalMag. It's called Coco Cal, but it's basically just a CalMag essentially. And so it'll be a CalMag and then the A and the B. When they're in clones, when I first take cuts, it'll be very mild. It'll be usually 1 mil per gallon on the CalMag and 1 mil per gallon on the veg A and B until I see roots form. And at that point, I'll up the CalMag to 2 mils and I'll keep the veg at 1 until I'm ready to essentially start acclimating them. And once I acclimate them, then I'll start slowly each week working up the feed. But our feeds change weekly from the day we take the clone until the day we harvest the plant. We don't ever have the same feed for 2 weeks in a row.
Are you measuring like the EC or have a TDS tester to measure like a ppm? And are you going off of that, or are you just kind of looking at the feeding chart and kind of using that and not touching the EC or ppm?
Neither. I'm not looking at the ppm, not looking at the EC, and I'm also not going off of anything data related. 100% of how I feed is strictly based on how the plant responds. I try to demystify, whenever I talk to people, man, I really do try to demystify the growing for people. I think that everybody should grow, I really do. And when people are like, why would you say that? It's bad for business. It's great for business. I'm trying to sell seeds. So in my business, the more people that grow, the better it is. I'm trying to sell tissue cultures. I'm trying to show people that growing for yourself is good, because once you smoke your own thing, you'll never want to smoke anybody else's again. And you may have had better stuff, but there's something rewarding about doing it yourself that is unexplainable unless you do it, and I encourage it. So yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's probably a little shock factor for some people, seeing that you're a little bit hands off when it comes to EC, ppm, and following a feeding chart. I imagine to begin, you probably had some struggles, right? And then you kind of figured it out over time, repetitive, and getting the experience. Now you grow healthy plants every time, I assume. Because when I went to your grow space, man, everything was healthy. Like everything.
Thank you.
There wasn't a deficiency anywhere.
I appreciate that, bro. Thank you. Yeah, so I guess it's because I try, like I was saying, I demystify it. So I utilize a lot of principles that nature would utilize, even though I'm indoor and even though I'm using salts, as people like to say. I really hate that term. We can dig into that later, but I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of people miseducating people and trying to say that salts are bad or somehow unhealthy for people. It's crazy talk. It's absolutely crazy talk. But no, I think that taking approaches to growing that mimic nature as much as possible will always result in a better end product. And so yes, in the beginning I screwed up some plants because I didn't understand exactly what they wanted in relation to specifically the nutrient line I use. But, then you find a range over time and you go, okay, cool, like 80% of anything I grow is going to probably be fine within this range, and then it's like, cool, we'll have the outliers and they'll show signs. If we get burning, all right, we got to back it off a little bit. If we get yellowing, all right, we got to increase it a little bit, I'm broadly speaking, but it really is kind of that simple, and so, yes, I don't focus on EC or ppm because it's again, I'm not a fan of putting that much science to it. I'll put that much science to getting my environment correct and getting the humidity dial to where I can have it within a 1 or 2% of exactly where I want it all the time. Same with temperatures, But outside of that, no. When it comes to the feed, in my opinion, the more within a range, the more inconsistent you are with your feeds, the better the plant will respond to that. And overall, the more trichome production you will develop, and overall, the higher terpenes and flavonoids and cannabinoids you'll get from doing that. And the reason being is that because in nature, the plants produce trichomes as when they're stressed, for various reasons. There's so many reasons the plants stress in nature to create trichome production. But all that to be said, the thing that we enjoy about the plant is the essential oils that are in those trichome heads. And those trichome heads are formed through various stresses. So if you can induce certain stresses by not letting the plant get comfortable and complacent by having the same exact feed every single day, and it knowing that at 10 a.m. when your lights come on, they're getting watered. Maybe instead 4 days a week you water it exactly when you want to water, but then those other 3 days, maybe one day you water an hour and a half late, maybe the other day you water 3 hours late. Maybe the other day you don't water until you see the plants just starting to have a full dry back and want to droop on you. Then you water. And then the rest of the week you go back to watering the same time. And when you do things like that, and when you don't worry about your ppms being the same, and you don't worry about your EC being the same, and you're okay with your pH fluctuating maybe 0.2 or 0.3, which a lot of people think that's a lot. It's not. It is more in hydro than it is soil, but it's still not a lot. And especially if you only pick 1 or 2 days a week to do that. Like those little things are what create a better product overall, because you're allowing the plant to have the same types of natural stresses it would have in nature.
I was going to ask you about pH next. Now, you already mentioned 5.5 pH for a 30 to 60 minute soak to begin, and then that's going to end up around 6.2, 6.5 pH. But how about the remaining parts of the grow, like the veg, flower? Are you aiming for a specific pH of the nutrient solution?
Yes. Yeah. So when we're in clones, I aim for between 6.2 and 6.4. When we get into vegging, meaning clones are acclimated and we're transplanting them, and we do 3 transplants essentially. So we go clone into the first transplant, which is an Aoki cube, and then we go those 1.5 inch Aokis into 4 inch. I forgot what they call them. The 6 inches are the Hugos. I forgot what the name is for the 4 inches, but we go into a 4x4x4 block, right? And then from there, we go into a 3-gallon pot. If it's a mom, 5-gallon pot. But if it's something that's going into production, it's a 3-gallon pot. So that's it. And so at each stage of that, we change the pH range until we get into flower. And then we maintain a consistent pH range for majority of flower. So we start out from 6.2 to 6.4. And then when we get into the 4 inch cubes, we go from 6 to 6.2. And then once we essentially are ready to transplant into pots, we'll keep it at around that 6. And then over the course of 3 or 4 weeks in veg, once we transplant into pots, we'll usually continue to veg for another 3 to 4 weeks. And then over that 3 or 4 weeks, we'll wean it off from 6.1, 6.0 to roughly 5.8. And once we hit 5.8, we'll flip to flower, and then we'll start our flowering. And then we'll usually maintain 5.8 until the very end of flowering, and we'll kick it down to 5.7. And that little tenth is you'll get a little bit more again in our system. I can't speak to everything, but in our system we'll get a little bit more trichome production, because then you're getting pretty low in the pH, which is fine in hydro, but you are getting down there. So you'll start seeing that adds a little bit of stress to the plant. So we'll get that little extra trichome production right at the end to just get that little bit of frost. So yeah, that's it. So I would say, from broadly speaking, 6.4 to 5.7 will be our range over the course of roughly the 14 to 16 weeks that plant will be alive from clone till harvest.
Got it. Now, have you ever encountered pH fluctuations that has caused problems with the plant's growth?
No. I mean, if you go crazy, yeah, of course, but everything's within range. So I find that if you keep, when we're talking pH, if you can keep it within 0.3, 0.4, you're not going to hurt the plant. That is a big swing, but it's not going to hurt the plant. So if something happens where maybe you didn't calibrate your pH meter or something like that, and you are an extra 1/10 or 2/10 off in one direction or the other, no, you're fine. It's not going to do anything. You'd have to skew it pretty bad. Okay.
Let's get into water and irrigation strategy next. You kind of touched upon it a little bit, but I'd like to get a little bit more detailed. You already mentioned using RO water. Now, I live in the same area that you do. The water out the tap is 485 ppm, yep. Almost unsafe to drink, according to EPA guidelines. Anything over 500 ppm is unsafe. Yeah. Just below that. But it's very high in sodium, bicarbonates, And my experience trying to use that water, that tap water, is just, it's been unsuccessful. You get lockouts that happen and really raggedy plants. So I use reverse osmosis. I know you use reverse osmosis. What do you do for an irrigation strategy?
So we just have it's really just a 3 stage, but it's technically a 2 stage, but we have a pre-filter system because of how bad the water is here. So we go into a pre-filter 2 stage. That's a sediment and a carbon filter. And those two kind of strip it down pretty good so that my main RO the membrane and whatnot doesn't have to get replaced as often. I'm replacing the pre-filter every 3 months, and that's allowing me to not have to replace the main filter usually for about a year, somewhere between 9 to 12 months. I'll get out of having to replace the main filters. Outside of that, I mean, yeah, once it comes out the RO, we store, like, I usually try to store 3 days. I've found that if we can have 3 days of backup, usually within 3 days, we can fix any issues. That's enough time where if a problem falls on a weekend or something like that, then we can't get somebody out for a Monday or something. We're fine. So I store 3 days, and as far as like irrigation, we don't utilize irrigation. We hand water everything, which that's another thing that a lot of people are kind of shocked about, is that, we'll have 100 plus lights going and it's all hand water, and people are like, oh, it's inefficient, it's this, it's that, you could be better utilizing your time to work on other aspects of the garden to make the plants healthier. I hear all the arguments, and a lot of that's, I mean, quite frankly, I'll keep the swearing to a minimum. This will be the only one I say. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. It's nothing. You can run through 100 lighter. You can have one employee run through water. If their sole job every day was to just water plants, one employee in a 6-hour shift could run through 100 plus lights. So it's not over. And I believe in doing that because it allows you to put your eyes on every single plant every single day. There is nothing that will get missed. There is nothing that will be overlooked. There's nothing that you won't see happening on one random plant. And also it allows, not all plants feed the same. Even if it's the same genetic, not all plants feed the same. If I have 100 clones of a given mom in a room, not all 100 of those clones are going to feed the exact same. They're all going to uptake slightly differently. So it'll allow you to see, like, oh, you know what? Today I can skip this plant. This plant's not drinking like the other 90 of its cousins. Like, it's just, it doesn't want water today. So that's the other thing, is it allows you to kind of feel things out, look at the plants, assess, and determine if you really even need to water that plant that day. And in hydro, I think that's better because gnats are a big thing in hydro. Gnats, I would say, more in hydro than anything I've ever seen. They're very prominent, and that's because, generally speaking, people that grow in hydro do utilize irrigation of some kind, and that irrigation keeps a constant moisture on the block or the rockwool, which allows perfect environment for gnats. So I don't do that. We also hand water because it allows us to do drybacks, which is something that people think is an absolute sin when you grow in hydro. And it's like, no, bro, you could totally do a dryback. It's all about just watching and just tending to the plants and understanding what they want. And so we do promote drybacks. We tell people, yes, you can dry back in hydro. You should dry back in hydro.
Yeah, I know your setup utilize all these different trays, and it would be perfect for a flood and drain. And I assumed that was the case, but then I remember that you said you hand water everything. How do you determine when to water, though?
So I mean, a lot of it just has to do with the plant's uptake. I don't stick to like a regiment, if that makes sense. Especially not when we're in veg. Once we're in flower, the way that we propagate the rooms, we know when to flip to flower from a size standpoint of the plant, where once we're in flower, the plant will drink every day, where if we didn't water it the following day, it would die. But we try to not get to that point until we're in flower. Leading up to that, like when we first transplant into the 4-inch cubes, that initial transplant day, we won't water those plants again. The clone into cube, or the clone into 4-inch block, that block being soaked, because there's no roots in it yet, because we just put it in there, it takes 4 or 5 days for those roots to spread out into that block a little bit. So we won't water those clones for 4 to 5 days until those blocks fully dry out. And then when we do water, it'll be a light watering. I'm not going to sit there and resaturate those blocks all the way fully because there's still not a massive root mass in there yet. So like even when we do go back and water, it'll be a light water to make it so that I don't have to water them every day. So that we can get the drybacks. It's always about the drybacks because in hydro, gnats are your worst enemy and they are coming all of the time. So, unless you want to utilize crazy shit, which I don't, you drybacks. Drybacks are the best way to try to fight those, especially in hydro.
Yeah, definitely helps with reducing the pests. Because on the flip side, if you keep the moisture content too high, you could have issues such as like overwatering symptoms and root rot, right? Have you ever come across those things?
No, because we do it how we do it. I mean, and I don't mean that at all in a cocky way whatsoever, but just because we don't have irrigation. And again, not to say people that grow with irrigation are going to screw themselves and it's a no-win scenario. It's not true. There are people running millions of lights across this country right now doing irrigation drip systems that are completely fine. But that being said, I just, no, I've never ran into root rot. There's no ability for it to happen, in the way we do it.
Got it. One thing that can show up on the Rockwool cubes, we actually had a conversation last time I was over there. We talked about the algae that's on there. And I think there's misconceptions about algae.
Yeah.
Break it down for us. Talk to us all about algae being on Rockwool. Is it harmful or harmless? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, completely harmless. It just doesn't look good. People want to see the Rockwool and it's pristine. So a lot of people will get the plastic inserts that go over so, the sun can't hit it. But algae, when we're talking specific plants, algae is completely harmless. It does nothing. It does act annoying because it creates like a little barrier on the top where you'll have to water like an extra couple of seconds to penetrate through the algae. Outside of that, it absolutely does nothing. It's common. Anywhere that you have water and light, constant water and light, algae will form. It'll do it in a fish tank. It'll do it in a pool. It'll do it anywhere. That's why we use chlorine in pools. That's why we use, cleaners and scrubbers in fish tanks and other fish to specifically eat algae. In nature figures out its own way to handle algae. But, we could do it, but now we're adding different things that don't need to be mixed into the plants just for the sake of taking out something that's already harmless for the plant anyways. So, yeah, it's just a lot of people look at it and they're like, oh my God, is that mold? No, it's just algae. It's no big deal. Calm down. But yeah, it's nothing. It's no big deal at all.
I think the only time it would be potentially a problem is if you see it on soil and your plant is struggling, right? Then you could potentially have an overwatering symptom that happens. And that happened to me before where it's like seeing that little bit of algae growth on there, look up at the plant and be like, uh-oh, looks like it's a little bit overwatered. So that might be an indication if you're in soil to kind of back off on things. But this is something that is in Jeff Lowenfeld's book. I'm not sure if you read Teaming with Microbes.
No.
Probably not, because I know you're not a soil guy, but he's very in-depth about utilizing microbes and growing plants and stuff like that. He has a whole chapter, a section on algae. Okay. And it talks about how really it breaks down to like silica. And so that's a non-essential element for the plant. So it's actually can be beneficial. So yeah, I figured I'd bring up algae because I know it's a common misconception when it comes to growing in Rockwool.
Yep. Yeah, and it's in everybody's. I mean, I've never seen a garden in Rockwool that doesn't have it, unless they're using those little plastic inserts that go over the blocks.
I've seen it in my humidifier before. And again, like you mentioned, that the sunlight does it on the water and algae could form. And, obviously I have to go in there and clean it and stuff. I had a pool and I had to manage my pool and you get algae blooms that come up. And what do? Well, there are products that you can buy to get rid of algae. Really what feeds the algae is phosphorus in particular. Like talking about I just think about me managing my swimming pool. There was a product called Phos-Free, which you put in once a week. And it, obviously you remove the plant material that's, the fallen debris that comes in the pool, remove all that because that's just feeding the algae. So anyways, it's funny how this all relates.
Yeah, there's correlations everywhere. And that's the thing is, again, going back to wanting to demystify it, the correlations between humans and plants are insane. The correlations between how humans reproduce and plants are insane. It's endless. Like it really is an ecosystem that isn't different than ours. It actually fits into ours. It's pretty cool.
Next, let's get into environment conditions. What do you typically aim for temperature, relative humidity? Do you supplement CO2? If so, what do you aim for there?
It all changes. Yes, and yes. So early on in life, like when we're talking clones before they're acclimated, we're obviously throwing them into trays with domes, ideally keeping them around 84, 85, 86 degrees with hopefully as close to 100% humidity as possible. Um, and then once they're acclimated, ideally I want my nursery to be somewhere between, 82 to, again, 84, 85 degrees with roughly 70% humidity. And then once we get into blocks and we start transitioning to closer to them being in pots, mid 60s to the 70s and, low 70s in humidity, and, maybe creeping down into the high 70s at night, but still maintaining around 80 to 82 in temperatures when the lights are on. And then once we get into pots, over the course of vegging, I'll get the room basically down to roughly 78, 79 degrees and around the mid to low 60s. And then once we start flowering, for the first 3 to 4 weeks of flowering, I'll maintain in the low 60s in humidity, and I'll maintain the high 70s. And then as flowering progresses, once sites actually form, that's when I'll start weaning everything off. Now, the exception to that is if I'm growing for rosin. When I'm growing for rosin, I do not wean off humidity. That's another conversation, but to stick to flower, I will wean off humidity and temps throughout the course of the rest of the flowering time of that plant. And so by the end, when I'm, in flush per se, I'll probably be somewhere in the range when the lights are on of around 68, 67, 69, somewhere in that range temperature wise, and roughly about 50% humidity. Again, for flower. And then, when the lights are off, that'll get down to probably 58, 59 in temperature. And humidity, same, roughly around 50%, and then when it's for rosin, we'll dip the temps, but not as crazy. I'll go down to maybe like 72, 73 when the lights are on, and maybe 66, 67 when the lights are off. But I will maintain the humidity in the mid to high 60s. Because you end up with a more resinous plant. And when you can maintain above 50%, even if you go 51%, if you can just maintain above 50% humidity, relative humidity, then naturally you're going to have less off-gassing of terpenes and things on the plant, and essential oils just kind of doing their thing. So, temps, yes, drop because it slows off gassing, but humidity, keep it higher, when we're talking for resin production or rosin production.
And then how about CO2 you're supplementing there? Are you measuring the ppm that's in the environment?
Yeah, no, that's something we will use.
Yeah.
That's a time where I will use ppm for sure. Yeah. So
what do you aim for different ppms throughout the different stages of growth?
So early on, just natural atmosphere is usually enough to take care of the clones. So, most atmospheres around where we're at is somewhere in the range of 400 to, between 350 and say 500 is what the natural atmosphere is. So that's plenty fine for clones. Once we get into blocks and they're not in domes anymore, I'll start introducing CO2 at roughly around 550 parts per million. So not much higher than natural atmosphere. And they'll stay there until we go into pots. Once we go into pots, I'll kick it up about 650. And then every week that I'm in veg in pots, which is usually 4 weeks for most strains, I'll kick it up 100. So week 1 of veg, I'll be at, say, 650, 750, 850, and at 950, like usually at the end of that week or sometimes at the start of that week, depending on the size of the plants, that's when I'll flip to flower. And then from flower, I found we've pushed it as high as 1900, 2000 at certain points of us just trying to see what would stress the plants out, and they were fine. I've found that you really have to kick it pretty high. You need to get really high, to almost where it's dangerous for humans. You need to get around 4,000 or 5,000 ppm to really hurt the plant. And I mean, you can maybe affect it less than that, but there's no need to do it. I didn't see a benefit in yield. I didn't see a benefit in higher terpenes or flavonoids or cannabinoid production when we would get it tested. So honestly, when we're in flower now, I keep it around 1,200, and that's it. I don't up it. I don't down it. I don't change it. Once I'm in flush, I'll usually cut off the CO2 entirely, which again, that's just an added stress to the plant. It's little things like that where that last week of flush is just no CO2 whatsoever. That room's going to deplete everything. When I walk in, the parts per million will be around 80 or 100, which is basically suffocating the plant at that point. And that's intentional, because again, it's an added stress right at the very end of life, it's no different than people doing that whole 3 days of dark thing, which I don't necessarily agree with, just because it's not really whatever. It's neither here nor there. It's just creating stress. It's just same concept. I just do it through kind of suffocating them a little bit, as opposed to just freaking them out for 3 days. I just kind of naturally let them deplete any CO2 around them.
Got it. Now you mentioned flush. That's probably sparked some people's interest when we talk about flushing.
Yeah.
You do flush at the end of the growth cycle. First of all, what is your definition of flush? Because there are a couple different definitions. Some people think that flushing is running a large amount of water through the medium. Other people consider flushing just stopping nutrients at a certain point. What's your definition of flushing, and how do you go about flushing?
So my definition of flushing is depleting the plant of any and all nutrients to the point where all that's left that it's uptaking is water, essentially. So it's the plant being depleted of any and everything, because when you can deplete it like that, that's going to make a much smoother smoke. It's going to make a much better cure. It's going to just make a much better end result of a plant. That quote unquote white ash that everybody, chases, which honestly is somewhat a myth that, I don't really care to debunk, but the white ash thing is kind of bull too. But, for the people that want to chase that, cool, just flush your plant a lot and you'll get a white ash. It's not guaranteed. You also got to not be an idiot and grow and care about your plants throughout the whole point. But if you cared about everything up to that point and then you flush on top of that to truly deplete the plant of any of its nutrients that it's going to have in the water leaves, in the sugar leaves, in the stalk, in the medium, to where it's literally just water in the inside of that plant, yeah, you're going to get it's just common sense. Like if you had dirty water and you ran it through a charcoal filter and now all of a sudden you have crystal clear, clean water, which one would you prefer to drink? So for that same logic, which one would you prefer to smoke? That's why I've always, to be honest with you, I've always had a beef with people that don't flush. Like a lot of soil growers, especially like the no-till people and the living soil people, they have this ideology that you don't have to flush, like nature doesn't flush. And it's like, no, guys, nature tills and nature flushes. Nature does flush. That's what a monsoon season is. And nature does till. That's what animals are. That's what storms are. That's what wind is. Like, that's what a lot of things are. Like 100% soil gets tilled in nature, and 100% there's insects, there's worms, there's things that are in the soil that are moving it around and tilling it. And that's underneath. On the surface, 100% surface layers of soil are getting removed every year through monsoon seasons and through just natural, storms, nature, Mother Nature doing what Mother Nature does. So yeah, I'm a firm believer that there's no scenario whatsoever where you should not flush your plants. I don't care what you grow in.
So to get to your goal of completely depleting the nutrition, are you running a large amount of water through it, or are you just cutting off nutrients and doing water only?
Water only. I'm cutting off nutrients, doing water only. Initially, like for the first couple of days of flush, I will, like, say for conversation's sake, I water 1 gallon per plant. I'll water 3 or 4 or 5 gallons. I'll just sit there and soak the medium to try to just flush the medium itself out, because it's a little more difficult with soil because soil wants to retain, right? But with hydro, it doesn't want to retain. So if you just literally run water through the medium long enough, you will rinse out all of whatever little deposits are still left in it. So the first couple of days, maybe a few days, I will just fully just oversaturate with water, but still just once a day, and still when the lights first come on, so that they have the next 23 hours to dry that out and get back to a dry period. I'm definitely not trying to sit there and just keep the medium soaked for a week straight. No. But yeah, the first couple of days I will way overwater the pots to literally just get them to the point where they're just flushing. And then after that, I'll just continue to water for until I see yellowing happening. Once, and not all genetics will do it. There are some genetics where I flushed them for weeks and they just would not, like after weeks, they would finally start to give me a little something. And it's like, dude, I know through labs that I don't need to flush this long. Like labs have shown me that past 5 days, you're technically passing any lab. There will be nothing that's showing up on the parts per million or parts per billion in their given, fields of where the ranges are for safety or not. So it's like after 5 days, at least with our nutrients, the way we do it, we're safe. So, but I've gone 2 weeks just to see, and there are a few genetics that won't fade, but I would say 9 out of 10 genetics will show you a fade. meaning that you'll start to see the plant from the tips like yellow out, and you'll see the green in the plant, the chlorophyll start to deplete out of the plant. And it'll just start to have this beautiful fade. Some are more beautiful, some are kind of ugly, but you'll just have a fade happen. And that's when you know, like, yeah, the plant's now basically starting to eat itself because there's nothing left. There's no nutrients anywhere for it to absorb. And then you can safely pull it.
Understood. Yeah, flushing is a super hot topic. A lot of people like to talk about flushing, and some people flush, some people don't flush. I'd love to know in the comment section below, for those folks that are tuning into this on YouTube in particular, comment below and let us know if you flush. If so, how do you go about it? If you don't flush, why don't you flush? Let us know. Let's spark some debate, friendly debate in the comment section here. I got a few more questions for you before I let you go. I want to know about common mistakes that are made when growing in Rockwool and how they can be avoided. Break it down for us.
For one, underwatering, again, and overwatering. There's people that won't understand that that Rockwool does not retain water like that, and they'll maybe go into it with an idea. Maybe you're somebody like, all right, I'll paint two scenarios. You're already a grower that you may want to switch to hydro, i.e. specifically Rockwool. If you come from soil or Coco where water will retain for a little bit, then naturally you're going to assume that water will retain in the hydro, or specifically Rockwool, and it's not going to. You will have to water every day. So underwatering for sure is a killer right away, because there's no buffer. If you forget or skip a pot, good luck. That next day that plant's dead. Like, especially the later in life they are. Maybe if they're clones, possibly if they're blocks, you can go back and try to save a plant. But no, once they're in pots, if you miss a date, they're dead. So yeah, underwatering is big, and overwatering, because most people that grow in hydro, traditionally speaking, in my experience of what I've seen around gardens, nobody is hand watering hydro. They're all hooking up drip systems of some sort, or drain to waste or something, So because of that, overwatering too, it's a super bad thing with hydro, and people do it because the first thing people think to do when they set up a hydro system is, how can I set up irrigation? And if you could rewire your mind and not think irrigation just because it's hydro, and instead think, well, no, let me still try to apply classic growing principles, i.e. potting. That's another thing that a lot of people don't do in hydro. I pot so that I can develop a root mass, So it's like little things like that, where if you just kind of don't think hydro and just think growing the same way that if you've grown before, you will continue to grow. Don't change it, And if you're new to it, then also don't run to a drip system, because you should learn your plants. And the best way to learn your plants is to see them every day. And the best way to see them every day is to have no choice but to walk up to that pot and water it. So it's like, there's just so many pros to it. And, other cons would be understanding that you have no buffer with pH. That's a big, big thing. In the beginning, if you want to monitor your ppms and your EC, do it. I'm not somebody that says don't do it, shame on you. There's a reason those numbers exist. There's a reason that they're correlated to certain things. And if you want to take a more scientific approach as you learn to grow, that's okay, because growing in hydro, generally speaking, is a much more scientific methodology of growing than soil. So you're already doing that if you're choosing to take the steps to grow in hydro, specifically Rockwool. So understanding that pH is not your friend if you mess it up. There is no buffer. Same with your overall EC. Basically anything, again, if you're coming from a world where you are an experienced grower trying to transition into something that maybe is a little easier on your back or something like that, just all the buffers that you have in what you do currently, they're not going to apply in hydro, specifically in Rockwool at all. Get rid of them. Realize that you got to be on your and then outside of that, if you're new to it altogether, I honestly tell people to stray away from it. I don't necessarily think beginner growers should maybe they can do hydro, but they shouldn't necessarily grow how I grow, because it is very, very dependent on you understanding how to read your plants and knowing when you're messing something up, or just more importantly, even down to the fundamentals of understanding what you're doing to the plant. What does the pH mean? What does too acidic or too alkaline even mean in relation to the plant, And so, there's a lot more in-depth understanding that you have to successfully do this, unless you were to follow my recipe. It's like, yeah, cool. If I just handed you my recipe, told you to buy my lights, my medium, my everything, and just do this, you're gonna be fine. But if you're just starting out and you hear this podcast and you're like, oh, I kind of want to try that, then yeah, just respect the fact that there is no buffer. You will have to have a natural, better understanding and a much sharper eye and a much, much greater attention to detail of the plant so that you can see those little things that are onsets to you messing something up.
Lots of tips there. Man, this has been very insightful for me. I mean, I am a soil grower. As much as you hate soil, I got to admit I'm a soil grower. But hearing about the differences, it's very interesting to me. I have used Rockwool cubes just to start seeds, clones, and so on and so forth. But I've never done a whole grow with Rockwool. I've seen your grows, and they're beautiful, but I've never done it myself. So it's really cool to sit down with you today and hear about how you do it. Let's wrap things up here. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you and what you have upcoming in the future?
Well, firstly, bro, let me just say thank you, man. I as somebody that's respected by a lot of people in the community, the fact that you appreciate what I'm doing and that you look at my gardens and you don't have knocks on them, I appreciate it, bro. So thank you for having me on here, and just thank you for just considering me an equal, bro. I respect what you do, for real. And as far as getting in touch with me and whatnot, we don't have, I'm now starting to say this on every podcast because I've been finding out that people are like creating telegrams and saying they're me and doing a bunch of really fucked up and taking money from people and whatnot. And it's just, we have no telegrams. And I'm not just saying this is not a ploy. I'm serious. We have no telegrams. We have no Snapchats. We have no nothing. There is no way you can contact me unless you go to my Swank Genetics Instagram or Swank Tools Instagram or the Swank Collection Instagram. And if you even try to ask me for products, I'm just going to block you. And there's so many people that can attest to that for the last 6 years that have been trying to get in touch with me that I don't respond. So yeah, if you want garden talk, if you want to just, chop it up about plants, if I can help you in any way, like that's what I want to do. There's not enough of that. And there's way too much gatekeeping in this community and way too much people that I have a problem with because all they want to do is act like their tech is something special. And it's not. This is a plant. Let's all grow it. So hit me up for reasons like that. Don't hit me up because you think I'm a trapper. Don't hit me up because you think you're going to get plugged. Hit me up because you want to learn and you want to talk plants. I'm all about that.
Awesome. I'll definitely have a link to your Instagram down in the YouTube description section below. And if you're on one of the podcast platforms, just search for them. You'll find them. Yeah, I see you've been making waves amongst several podcasts. I know you're on From the Stash, like I mentioned. I'll link that episode down in the, 2 episodes actually. I'll link it down in the YouTube description section below so people can go to those episodes next. But you're also on Goblin's channel. I saw that. I caught that. You made an appearance on that one. Definitely want to give a shout out to our Patreon folks as well. Those folks that are supporting this podcast through Patreon. 100% of the money that gets donated through Patreon goes right back into the podcast. Helps keep the lights on in the studio. So thank you so much. I'm putting names on the screen right now for those folks that are on the producer tier. Special thanks to you. Chris, once again, thanks so much. And I'll let you go. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, bro. Appreciate you, man.
Peace out, everyone. Catch you in the next episode.